Alright everybody, we're gonna make this game, and it's gonna be an open world MMO, and the world is gonna be completely deformable. You will build your own characters, level them up, and create entire kingdoms with your friends. You'll be able to craft awesome gear for your character or trade it with other players. You can play as a multitude of different classes and races. You can play as a deer, sorcerer, and enjoy a gameplay experience like never before. You can even play as an entire colony of ants, also a sorcerer. There will be a massive skill tree that has your equipped gear integrated into it for the richest customization you've ever seen. The game will be challenging too. No more waiting for the action. The action will find you, even on those loading screens. You won't have to wait for this game to be released either, because we're almost out of beta and we just need to make sure we didn't forget. Oh yeah, what's gonna happen when players die? If you're watching this, most of the video games you've played probably involve death. You die when something bad gets you or when your health reaches 0. Every hazard in the game is designed to inflict death upon you in some way, yet the treatment of death itself often seems like an afterthought in the game development process. It's as if all this time was put into how amazing the game will be when players aren't dead, which is great, but the being dead part is just crudely thrown in at the end as if, anything will do. Death comes with some kind of penalty. The penalty is usually very easy to understand. If you die, you lose a life and resurrect at a checkpoint. If you die, you have to wait to respawn. If you die, you lose experience or gold or items. If you die, you start the game over from the beginning. Being simple is great, but developers often underestimate how much impact a poorly designed penalty system can have on the rest of the game. What is the goal of a penalty, and how severe should it be? Let's analyze some common assumptions. Penalties make a game challenging. The idea is that by putting a penalty on certain paths that a player can take, the number of paths is limited and thus the game gets more challenging. It's hard to disagree with that, but there are limits on how much challenge can be increased merely by dialing up penalties. Let's say in some game, somewhere, in some level, there's a hole in the ground. Now let's compare 4 different penalty options for falling into that hole. 1. The player can just walk over the hole with no penalty. 2. The player loses some health and gets teleported backward a bit. 3. The player dies and restarts the level. 4. The player dies, the game uninstalls itself, and the computer explodes. Does completing the level get more challenging as we dial up the penalty? Well, assuming it's harder to jump over that hole than just walk over it, moving from penalty 1 to penalty 2 is an increase in challenge, since now the easier method is disincentivized. Moving from penalty 2 to penalty 3 would only further increase the challenge if there were still some reason for the player to want to fall into that hole under penalty 2, but otherwise, as long as there's nothing to be gained by falling into that hole, and the player can't complete the level unless they avoid it, there's no increase in challenge moving from penalty 2 to penalty 3. Moving from penalty 3 to penalty 4 definitely increases the pain of falling into that hole, but it doesn't make it any more challenging to complete the level. We basically maxed out the challenge that this hole offers somewhere between penalty 2 and 3. Here's a good analogy from electronics. Resistors connected in parallel behave like the different paths a player can take. The overall difficulty of getting from point A to point B does increase by increasing the difficulty of one of the paths, but it can never exceed the difficulty of the alternative path. If one path cannot lead to completion due to a penalty, it's analogous to a break in the wire or an infinite difficulty in traversing it, but still, the overall difficulty of getting from A to B would just equal the difficulty of the alternative path. This is why penalties have rapidly diminishing effect on challenge. Challenge isn't the only purpose of penalty, though. Let's look at another assumption. Penalties teach players to get better. Sometimes in game discussions, the word better is used as if it means more able to avoid penalties. But if penalties teach players to get better, and better just means more able to avoid penalties, that means penalties teach players to get more able to avoid penalties, which is true by default, but it's not saying anything interesting. Also, if better means more able to avoid penalties, then not playing the game is how you become the best at it. So, assuming that we have some other idea of what better means, the question is, can penalties teach players to get better? Well, yes, punishments are a mechanism of operant conditioning in psychology, but how effective are they versus the other mechanisms? Let's assume that getting better at the game is the desired behavior, and dying is the undesired behavior. There are 4 methods under operant conditioning to teach a player. Positive punishment, which could be penalizing a player for dying, positive reinforcement, which could be a reward for completing a level, negative punishment, which could be denying level rewards if a player dies, and negative reinforcement, which could be returning lost rewards if a player completes a level. The methods involving punishment are notoriously less effective at conditioning a desired behavior than those involving reinforcement. The reason for this is that good behavior is often not the direct opposite of bad behavior. Discouraging a bad behavior doesn't necessarily lead the subject, aka the player, to the good behavior. It just leads them to avoid the thing that punishes them. Yes, it's possible that punishment will lead toward the good behavior, but it can also lead to some secondary behavior, or to some even less desired behavior, as long as the punishment is avoided. Reinforcements can be more directly connected to the good behavior, and thus are more effective in general. If you've ever trained a pet, or a human, before, you know what I'm talking about. Both penalties and rewards are important, but we have to be realistic about which deserves the most emphasis in a game, if the goal is to teach players. Teaching isn't the end of the story, though. Let's look at another assumption. Penalties add to the thrill. This is a big one, arguably the whole purpose of games in the first place. Thrill is the adrenaline rush associated with anticipating something. In a game, penalty or reward outcomes and how close the game can make them seem has a lot to do with thrill. Penalty is thrilling as long as it doesn't get you, and frustrating if it does. Reward is thrilling if you can get it, but frustrating if you can't. However, thrill is also very subjective. Your brain will prepare you for negative and positive outcomes using a combination of facts and subconscious bias. Here's an example. The game is, we flip a coin, and you either lose a potion or gain a potion, 50-50 odds. So how much thrill do you feel when this coin is flipped? The expected value of the flip is 0 potions, but chances are, once that coin starts tumbling through the air, your brain started anticipating something. You might be dreading the loss of a potion, or you might be preparing to gain one with your fingers crossed, willing it to happen with your telekinetic powers. It's unlikely that you actually felt nothing at all, like the odds would dictate. Even for the games that aren't so simple, where the outcomes aren't so few or so equal, and where you can swing the odds in your favor, there's always that uncertainty where our bias is allowed to thrive. Games will often try to create the illusion that penalties or rewards are closer than they truly are, amping up that thrill, playing on our bias in the same way that a casino does. At the end of the day, though, perception is what matters. Thrill is thrill, frustration is frustration. The best we can do is to recognize the signs that something might be wrong with our game. If players aren't adequately avoiding the penalties that we've laid out, such as walking through fire or ignoring enemy attacks, we may need to change them. If players are avoiding them too much, like they avoid challenges or quit the game, we may also need to change them. So what is an ideal penalty? I want to define something called the basic setback, which is a starting point to answering this question. It maximizes the challenge and conditioning goals of penalty that we already talked about, but not necessarily the thrill goals. When a player commits some punishable act, such as dying, the basic setback places them back to where their actions began correlating with that act. So, if a player falls off a cliff, they're set back to the point where their actions started being useful for avoiding the cliff, such as near the cliff top. If a player loses all their hit points, they're set back to the point where their actions started being useful for keeping those hit points, such as the last place where the player had full hit points. So you might say, wait, falling off a cliff also involves losing all my hit points, so do I get set back to the cliff top, or back to the beginning of the level, or what? Well, if that cliff is going to take all my hit points, regardless of what happened before falling, the cliff top is the answer. This is because any actions the player took before that wouldn't have had anything to do with the falling. Here's another example. A player is slain by an enemy somewhere in the middle of a level. For each event leading back in time from the death, ask the question, did actions further back correlate with it? Once the answer changes from yes to no, you've found the basic setback point. In this example, the heart power-up heals the player to full life. If something always heals the player to full life, losses of life before that aren't correlated with any losses after that. This is why it makes sense to have checkpoints or save points at the inn. The basic setback is related in a sense to how much memory the game has of contributing events. Resources like life, ammo, or number of lives behave as a sort of record of past actions. The farther back in time relevant resources can be correlated with a player's death, the farther back in time the basic setback places the player. The basic setback can be difficult to pin down, but that's not really the point. The thought process is a starting point for analyzing a penalty, even when a game level is very non-linear and lacks any obvious checkpoint type things that deaths can be traced back to. If a penalty in a game seems wrong, compare the time lost in that penalty to the time lost by the basic setback. Ultimately, penalty is one of the tools that developers use to define the spectrum of success and failure in a game. It's not a throwaway concept like a lot of games treat it as.